after her controlling husband turned physically abusive, Jennifer Corbin was looking to get out of the marriage. What she didn't know was that 14 years before, another woman tried to leave him, and the two women, who never met, would forever have their names linked to this one man. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Hello and welcome to Crimelines. A quick look ahead at the schedule. Next week is the 5th Wednesday of the month, so I will not have an episode. But if you miss me too much, you can always check out Crimelines and Consequences, which is available wherever you get your podcasts. Or you can check out my premium content, Beyond the Files, which is on the Crimelines Patreon feed, as well as Apple subscriptions. My kids are about to wrap up the school year, and with them home for the summer, I cannot really make any promises about the release schedule. Most years I've been able to stay weekly or at least only take a couple weeks off, so if there's just 1 week where there's no episode, know that I traded researching true crime for a park day with my kids. And it is what it is. This time when they're young is so fleeting, and while my husband and I have a pretty good trade-off schedule for the summer, where one of us is working while the other's making memories, things happen. I definitely won't have as many hours as I usually have during the school year, so maybe I'll just learn to be more efficient. Who knows? I know no one else cares if I take a week off, but I do have to tell myself that it's okay to not work around the clock. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into today's episode. All of my sources are linked, as always, but I do want to mention one at the top, and that is Anne Rule's book, Too Late to Say Goodbye. It is one of her later full-length true crime novels, and the background information in there was pretty important to putting together this episode. This is one of those cases that I've been aware of, but I started digging into it and realized just how much I did not know. We are going to start with Jennifer Corbin, who was born in January of 1971 in Bowling Green, Kentucky. She grew up the middle of 3 girls, and she was quick with a smile and a laugh, but she was also the stereotypical middle child who did things her own way. Her family moved to Georgia when she was young, and after high school, Jen went to college in Savannah. She considered going into nursing, and she did take a few pre-nursing classes, but she wasn't entirely sure which direction her life would take her at that point. She was a caretaker at heart, so it's really easy to see why nursing was an attractive option for her. In 1995, when Jen was 24, she was working at an oyster bar with a man named Bobby Corbin. Bobby introduced Jen to his older brother Bart, and the two hit it off. Bart was a little bit older than Jen. He was 32, and his career appeared to be on the rise. He knew what he wanted to do since he was an undergraduate student. He wanted to be a dentist. He attended and graduated from the Medical College of Georgia, and like a lot of new dentists, he put in some time working in someone else's practice while he started making plans to launch his own. In 1996, Jen and Bart took a romantic trip to Italy, and it wasn't long after that trip that Jen found out that she was pregnant. She and Bart talked about it and decided to go ahead and get married. It seemed like the natural next step in their relationship anyway. So on September 1st, 1996, they got married, and then their son was born in March of 1997. Jen was a stay-at-home mom for the next few years, and they had a second son in January of 1999. Bart was not ready to have another baby so soon and reportedly did not have a pleasant reaction to the news. But Jen was up for the challenge. With 2 under 2, Jen's life was full-on mom mode until the boys were about preschool age. At that point, Jen got a part-time job at the preschool at their church, which worked perfectly for her schedule. She could work part-time, and again, this is a caregiving position, but she would still have energy left over for the boys in the evenings, and having that energy after work was very important. Bart was the type of guy who left all of the household duties to his wife. She did the cooking, the cleaning, the mowing of the yard, all while also doing most of the parenting. Bart focused on his work, but when he was home, he expected Jen's time to be spent with him. According to Anne Rule, Bart put an entry in his journal complaining that Jen spent an hour cleaning the kitchen when she could have instead spent that time with him. Bart was particular about what he imagined his life would look like. And for several years, Jen just took it. Even when he withheld compliments, instead critiquing her to try to get her to change into what he wanted, she let a lot of it roll off her back. She told her family it was fine because he wanted to be the king of the house and it didn't really bother her that much. The good times outweighed the bad by a lot. But as often happens, the scales slowly started shifting. The bad started weighing quite a bit more. One issue in the marriage was their financial situation. Bart wanted to run his own practice, but he had trouble building a loyal client base because, well, let's be blunt, it was because of his personality. Patients complained about his bedside manner, or his lack of bedside manner, and that is tricky when you're a dentist. A lot of people have dental anxiety, and imagine being worried about a procedure, and then you have a dentist who is cold, distant, and yelled at his office staff. The yelling at his staff and the literally cursing during procedures really turned a lot of people off. Bart ended up with one pretty significant complaint against him with the Georgia Board of Dentistry. He oversold his ability to do a specific procedure, and the woman had to immediately seek medical care because he couldn't get her mouth to stop bleeding. The complaint wasn't necessarily about the mishap, those things can happen, but she had prepaid for the procedure. He didn't complete it, so she wanted her money back. From my understanding, she wasn't even asking for medical bills to be paid due to the bleeding. She just wanted a refund of the money she did pay Bart for the work he didn't do, which seems pretty reasonable to me. But Bart would only give her a partial refund, so she went to the board and they ordered him to repay her the rest. Business ended up being so slow that he defaulted on payments for some dental equipment and asked another dentist to let him know if he needed to hire some part-time help. Building a dental practice is a full-time job. I mean, it's really full-time plus. And if Bart was working even part-time for someone else, he would never be able to keep his own practice afloat. But he needed the money. They owned a very nice home in Beaufort, Georgia, that he took out a second mortgage on, and he started moving things into Jen's name just to keep them from creditors. And another part of Bart's method for managing their strained finances was to keep Jen on a very tight budget. He did this from the beginning of their marriage, deciding how much she could have for groceries and household expenses, and he would check her receipts to make sure she didn't buy anything they didn't need. So money and lack of money was definitely a stressor, and the arguments over some little thing Jen bought at the grocery store that wasn't approved by Bart definitely got old. But it seems, based on the timeline of what happened, it wasn't so much how Bart treated Jen that really started bothering her. It was really how he treated their children. Bart aimed his hypercritical commentary to their 7-year-old, even out in public. He would yell at him during Little League games to the point that Jen wouldn't even sit with him anymore because it was embarrassing. He would call this little boy names like idiot, and it was just too much. Over the course of their marriage, Jen had suspected Bart was cheating on her with someone who worked in his office, which he was. She had put up with him criticizing her over everything from her intelligence to the nail polish she wore. She dealt with his tirades over the money she spent. But things started falling apart when he started treating their children poorly, and that's why I think that was her breaking point. Jen wasn't entirely sure what to do about it, though. If they split up, the boys would go with Bart alone during his parenting time. Being a jerk isn't enough of a reason for a court to deny unsupervised visits, So which was better? Staying together at first seemed like the best idea for everyone. She could be there as the buffer between Bart and the kids. But that left Jen feeling very alone and somewhat isolated in the marriage, particularly in the hours after she put the boys to bed. So Jen turned to the internet for entertainment and she started playing an online game called EverQuest. For those not familiar with this game, first, welcome to the club, and second, welcome to Wikipedia, which is how I know what EverQuest is. According to Wikipedia, it is a massively multiplayer online role-playing game where you complete quests with your team. The relevant part of this game for us today is that you can communicate with people in the game, so there is also this social component to it, which is attractive if you're someone who's feeling alone and trapped in your real life. Jen loved the game and soon became friends with a player named Chris. They played the game together and chatted. Then little flirtations between them grew until they were sending each other some pretty spicy emails, and Jen started seeing the possibility of a life outside of her marriage to Bart. In September of 2004, Jen and Bart had been married for about 8 years, and Jen told Chris that she worried that she was stringing him along since she was married at the time and not currently looking to get a divorce. But though Jen was staying in the marriage, she couldn't exactly fake being passionately in love with Bart anymore, and he noticed. We know he noticed because he started confiding in her family about it, even complaining to her mom that Jen wasn't having sex with him anymore. Over the years, Bart had grown pretty close to Jen's family, and he considered them his friends, so going to them was not entirely unexpected, but still, what an awkward situation, particularly for Jen's mom. Eventually, after a couple months of this, her sister called one of Bart's brothers and suggested he help support his brother. Bart noticed the emotional distance growing between him and Jen, and then he started suspecting that Jen was now preparing to leave him. It started when he went to go buy a classic car and he had his credit report run. Yes, while keeping Jen on a tight budget with a failing business, he bought a car he didn't need. Anyway, on that credit report was a credit card that Bart didn't know about. Jen had secretly gotten it and started buying household goods with it. Because Bart would at any time review her receipts and spending, there was really no way she could squirrel anything away from the family funds. And she knew if she left him, he would do what he had to keep her from accessing money when she needed it the most right after leaving. So she started buying these little things and storing them at a warehouse at her mother's business. If she had to walk out with nothing but her children, she would be ready. By November of 2004, Bart knew that Jen had one foot out the door, and he said he wanted to see a marriage counselor. For Jen, it was too late for that. She had previously suggested it, and Bart shot her down, saying that he didn't want to air out their business to a counselor they didn't know. And in her heart, Jen had moved on to her online friend, Chris. Bart did not initially know about this online affair, though he did notice how much time Jen was spending playing the game, and he did accuse her of being addicted to it. And I call this an online affair because that's where it started and that's where it stayed. Jen and Chris had never met in person, and they never even spoke on the phone. Anytime Jen tried to have a phone call or arrange an in-person meeting, Chris had some excuse for why it was bad timing. And the real reason for this bad timing was that Chris wasn't Chris. Chris was a woman named Anita. Now, remember I said EverQuest is a role-playing game. It isn't unheard of for people to play characters that didn't represent them in real life. That's part of the fun. So Anita started playing as a male named Chris, and she struck up a friendship with Jen. And then their friendship got closer, and then it turned romantic, and then it just got away from her until she knew she had to come clean. On November 18th, Anita emailed Jen and told her the truth. Jen was, understandably, very upset and initially cut off contact with Anita. But then she spent a few days processing it. Did it really matter that Anita was a woman if the rest of it was true? Maybe it did, but regardless of anything else, Anita was a friend that Jen had been confiding in about Bart. And unlike others in her life who would suggest maybe try marriage counseling, maybe work things through with Bart, Anita supported her moving ahead with a divorce. So it really was just a matter of days of silence between them before Jen and Anita started talking again. And now, without this big secret between them, they exchanged phone numbers. Jen also printed out some of the emails she wanted to keep and stashed them in her purse. She deleted most of them from the computer because she didn't want Bart to find them. She knew that would not end well. A week after Jen learned the truth about Anita, she and Bart took the kids over to her sister's house for Thanksgiving dinner. On the drive over there, they stopped at the grocery store to pick something up, and Bart waited in the car with the kids while Jen ran in. When Jen got back into the car, she could tell Bart was angry. He was angry through the entire family dinner, barely talking to anyone, and making it pretty awkward. After the main meal was over, Bart abruptly stood up and said it was time to leave. No conversation about it. The boys wanted to stay and play with their cousins, but if Bart wanted to leave, they were leaving. They barely made it out the door when Bart started screaming at Jen. It turned out he had gone through her purse while she was in the grocery store and saw the printed out emails from Chris. He had been seething about this online affair all day, and now he was letting it all out. Yes, this man who had been having an on-again, off-again affair for most of their marriage was shocked at this betrayal. Jen managed to get Bart, who had also had several glasses of wine by that point, herded to the car, and she strapped the boys in. They drove off, and at some point along the drive, Bart, from the passenger seat, hauled off and hit Jen in the face. This strike has been called a punch in some of the reporting and a slap in other places. Now, I'm not sure it really matters which it is, but it did make my brain go down a little bit of a rabbit hole on the subtext of a slap versus a punch. But regardless, we do know that he hit her in the face and basically told her it was her word against his if she told anyone about it. The arguing continued on the ride home, and Jen called her family when they got there. She told them what happened, and her dad told her to pack up the kids and head back to her sister's house. Today's podcast is brought to you by newspapers.com, the ultimate destination for exploring the mysteries of the past. As I've said before, newspapers.com supports every Crimelines episode because if you check out my sources, you'll see that I use their newspaper archives to explore all of these true crime cases. And if you're fascinated by true crime, get ready to dive into the stories that made headlines. Newspapers.com offers nearly 1 billion pages of historical newspapers from the U.S. and beyond, and you can search the entire collection in seconds. Their vast newspaper collection is a gold mine for eyewitness accounts, crime scene photos, news reports, all those little details we like, and more. Whether you're interested in famous crimes or long-forgotten cases, newspapers.com gives you a front row seat to more than 300 years of history. For my listeners, newspapers.com has a special offer. Use the code CRIMELINES for an exclusive 20% discount on your subscription. That's promo code CRIMELINES at newspapers.com. Sign up today and start unraveling the true crime mysteries that keep you up at night.
Say goodbye to your credit card rewards. Greedy corporate mega stores, led by Walmart and Target, are pushing for a law in Congress to take away your hard-earned cash back and travel points to line their pockets. The Durbin-Marshall credit card bill would enact harmful credit card routing mandates that would end credit card rewards as we know it. If you love your credit card rewards, tell your lawmakers, hands off my rewards. Tell them to oppose the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill.
Bart called Jen's family, and he denied he instigated anything. He said that it was Jen who started it by putting her hands on his throat, and he accidentally hurt her while trying to get her off of him. They didn't believe him, not just because they believed Jen, but because he seemed to forget there were two witnesses strapped in that back seat. Jen and Bart's children witnessed this. Jen and the kids spent the night at her sister's house and then went home the next day. Jen and Bart were already at that point sleeping in separate rooms, and she thought things would be calm enough that she could just stay in the house. They could make it through Christmas for the sake of the kids and then figure out what comes next after. But Bart decided to file for divorce sooner than that. He filed on November 29th, hoping that by filing first, it would put him in better standing. In his petition for divorce, he asked for full custody of the boys, all of the marital assets, but he wanted to split the debts 50-50. Bart then started moving money around and taking out cash advances on his credit card. To help in the divorce, Bart wanted to find evidence of this affair Jen was having. So the first thing he did was he started looking for Chris's number on Jen's cell phone. He had taken it from her purse when he found the emails. Of course, there was no Chris in there, so he never would have found him, but he did call multiple numbers he didn't recognize, trying to figure out if one of them was Chris. He also took the computer hard drive to a data recovery center, hoping to retrieve any emails that she deleted. In the meantime, Jen consulted with an attorney of her own who warned that leaving the house could be twisted by Bart into abandonment, and that she should stay as long as it was safe. So Jen decided to stay in the house, but knowing that she'd have to support the kids largely on her own, she applied for full-time work. She also ordered a new cell phone to replace the one Bart had taken. The two of them were both making their moves towards divorce, but while still living under the same roof. On December 1st, 2 days after Bart filed for divorce, Jen was downstairs running on the treadmill around 6 a.m., and Bart was upstairs taking a shower. When Jen finished running, she went upstairs and found that her purse had been emptied out. Her credit card, journal, and new cell phone were gone. She asked Bart, probably not very nicely, where these things were, and he ran out of the house. Mind you, Bart had just gotten out of the shower, so he was wearing only a towel, clutching Jen's belongings, and hopping into his car. Jen grabbed the cordless phone and called 911 to report that Bart was stealing her things. She went outside and stood behind his car to try to stop him from leaving, but he started backing up anyway. While on the line with the dispatcher, Jen got out of the way of the car, but not entirely, so Bart ran over her foot. Jen also told the police that they had a shotgun in their house that they kept unloaded in a closet, and it was gone, and she thought that Bart may have taken it. Jen went in to have her foot x-rayed, and they found that there were no broken bones. She decided not to press charges against Bart, but by the time he got home, she had packed up and left. Again, Jen spent a night away and then went back. Her family didn't want her to, but she knew legally leaving the house put her at a disadvantage in the divorce. So she and Bart spent December 2nd and December 3rd mostly avoiding each other. He went to work and then out afterwards, and Jen didn't care where he was as long as he wasn't home. December 3rd was a Friday, and Bart came home pretty much long enough to eat dinner with the family and bicker with Jen, before he left the house to go out with some friends around 9-ish. Jen put the kids to bed around 10, and then she hopped on to play her video game and chat with Anita. They stayed up until about 1:40 in the morning. Then, around 7:30 in the morning, Jen's neighbors, Kelly and Steve, heard a knock at their door. It was Jen's 7-year-old, upset, saying that his mommy wasn't breathing and that his daddy had killed her. He asked Kelly to call 911. Kelly wasn't sure what was going on. Maybe he had a nightmare, thought it was real, and ran over to the neighbor for help. So Kelly walked over and let herself into Jen's house, calling Jen's name and getting no response. She went into Jen's bedroom where she found her lying diagonally across the bed. Initially, it just looked as if she was sleeping, but when Kelly touched her arm, she was cold. And that's when Kelly noticed a small amount of blood coming from her nose. 33-year-old Jennifer Corbin was dead. Kelly grabbed the cordless phone, but the battery was dead, and that's actually why Jen's son went across the street to look for help. He had tried to call 911 himself, but the phone didn't work. So Kelly took the two boys across the street to her house and called 911 from there. The dispatcher wanted to talk to Jen's son directly, and he asked him questions like, was his dad home the night before? And he said, yeah, he's the one who killed my mom. He said his parents had been fighting for a long time, but he meant for months, not that they had been fighting all night, because after he went to bed around 10 o'clock, after Bart left, he slept through the night. He didn't witness anything. But in the weeks leading up to Jen's death, he had become so scared of Bart and his temper, he would hardly leave Jen's side. So when he couldn't wake Jen up, he just assumed Bart had killed her. In an interview with the police later, he repeated that he hadn't seen his dad kill his mom, but he said he figured it out himself. This poor boy, he was only 7. When the police responded to the house, they found that Jen had been shot behind her right ear. Though stippling, which is the burning from the gunpowder, was not seen, there was soot around the wound, so they knew it was at close range but not contact. The gun was partially covered by the comforter in the bed, and the divorce papers were nearby. Jen's hands were bagged and her body was sent for an autopsy. Though at least one investigator thought the scene looked staged to look like a suicide, they needed more information to make that the official ruling. But before Jen's body had even been removed from the scene, the investigators wanted to talk to Bart Corbin. He had found out that Jen had been killed when the neighbor Steve called Bart's mother, who called his brother Bobby, and it turned out that Bart had slept at Bobby's house the night before, so he was the one who had to break the news to Bart. He said Bart got very upset and ran to the bathroom and started vomiting. When the police talked to Bobby on the phone, he told them that Bart was too upset to speak to them, but that they would be over to the house soon. And then they didn't show up. The lead investigator called Bobby again, and this time he seemed hesitant to commit to coming out to the house. He said that Jen's family had started calling and accusing Bart of killing Jen. The investigator said that they were still in the process of figuring out what happened, and Bobby said he'd call him back. It was a few hours later before Bart's lawyer called the police and let them know that he was representing Bart. The police said they had a warrant for a gunshot residue test, which Bart showed up to submit to that day. But he refused to answer any questions, including ones that were not about the murder. Like if there was anything the police needed to do to secure the scene when they finished processing it. He wouldn't answer. It was clear Bart was not going to speak to them at all. Bart's GSR test was negative, but at that point, they knew Jen had died at least a few hours before her son found her, around 7:30. Bart's hands weren't tested until 4 p.m. It would have been more surprising if they did find gunshot residue. It's usually gone within 6 to 8 hours in someone who is alive and moving around. Had Bart showered, it would have been gone even sooner. I know there are some people out there who think that if you hire a lawyer very quickly in an investigation, it shows you have something to hide. But I'm not one of those people, and I don't think that move was all that suspicious. But the next move Bart made seemed very strange to me. Rather, it's a move he didn't make. He didn't try to get his children. He left them in the care of the neighbors until Jen's family came and got them. He didn't even try to contact them for a few days, even though he was making other phone calls all weekend. I get if he didn't want to talk to the police or didn't want to talk to Jen's family, but you would have thought he'd make some effort to see his children. In part due to this inaction, Jen's family applied for and were granted emergency custody. Jen's autopsy was conducted the day after her body was found, and the test for gunshot residue on Jen's hands was negative, and she also didn't have any blood spatter on her hands, which you would expect to see if she had shot herself. But that's not enough to rule out suicide completely. However, when you pair it with the way the gun was found in the bed, the circumstances definitely point away from suicide. The ME found that the bullet had severed Jen's brainstem. She would have immediately lost her grip on the gun, and based on the position she was laying, it would have fallen behind her, either landing on the mattress or possibly even falling to the floor. Instead, it was found with the barrel partly under the comforter near her hand. It was absolutely impossible it would have landed there naturally. It looked more like someone was trying to stage a suicide. Though the killer missed the detail of where the gun would have naturally fallen, instead trying to put it near her hand, they did add some other details. There was a glass of wine on the nightstand, even though Jen's blood alcohol level was 0. And the divorce papers were near her, all to craft this narrative that Jen was up late drinking and she was distraught over the upcoming divorce when she decided to take her life. But physics said that didn't happen, so this case was ruled a homicide. And they knew from Jen's phone records and computer records that she was still alive until at least 1:40. Based mostly on rigor mortis and body temperature, it was determined Jen died 4 to 5 hours prior to being found, meaning around 2 or 3 in the morning. And this aligns with something the neighbor Steve said. He had gotten home late that night, around 1:45 in the morning, and he was tinkering around his garage before going to bed. Steve heard a truck come down the road, and he recognized the sound as Bart's. You know how when your neighbor has a distinct sounding car or motorcycle, you know it when you hear it? Steve said he knew Bart's truck, and it came to the house and stopped. Then about 15 to 20 minutes later, he heard it start up again and leave. So the police really wanted to talk to Bart to find out what he was doing around 2 a.m., but he continued not to talk. So they would end up building out his alibi through other witnesses, but that wouldn't come without subpoenas. And before they even got that far, they got a call that expanded this investigation. The call initially went to Jen's family. When the news hit about Jen's death, the family was of course flooded with condolences from people who knew Jen and even people who didn't. And one call 2 nights after her murder was from a woman Jen worked with. She mentioned that she had a relative who had been in dental school with Bart, and though it was many years ago, she remembered that there was an incident there where Bart's college girlfriend had died in an assumed suicide. Now that Jen had died and the manner of death had not been made public yet, she thought it was worth mentioning. She knew the girlfriend's name was Dorothy or Dolly. The family told her to call the police with this tip, which she did the next morning. And this turned out to be a very accurate and important tip. The woman in question's name was Dorothy, but she went by Dolly. Dolly Hearn was born in July of 1962, and she grew up in the Atlanta area. Her father was a dentist, and she would help in his office as an assistant. And she saw how kind he was and how his work really helped people. Like I've already mentioned, going to the dentist can be anxiety-filled for some people. And by making it more comfortable for them, Dolly's father increased the chances that they would seek dental care and just have overall better dental health. Inspired by this example, Dolly attended the Medical College of Georgia to pursue her degree in dentistry. While there, she met fellow student Bart Corbin, who was a year ahead of her. The two dated for about a year and a half total, though it was on and off. When it was on, it was very on, and that's part of why Dolly would break things off. She felt suffocated by Bart, who was possessive of her and her time, not unlike that journal entry complaining about his wife spending too much time cleaning and not enough time with him. Bart would also get very jealous of the time she spent with male friends and classmates, which I'm not sure what he expected her to do about that. It's unreasonable to expect someone not to work with or have friends of a different gender in any circumstances. But at dental school? In 1990, only 12% of practicing dentists were women. Yeah, I looked it up. So how was Dolly going to avoid other men? In mid-1989, they split up again, but in the fall they reconciled when Bart made promises to stop acting jealous about her male friends. It didn't last, and Dolly broke up with him again in October, in part because he was talking about marriage, and she was not ready for that step. For starters, she wanted to finish school first and establish her career. Bart was graduating, and his expectation would be that she would follow him wherever he set up his practice. The other issue was that Dolly wasn't sure they were that great of a match. The thing they had in common the most was dentistry, but they were coming at it from two different angles. Dolly was very passionate about how she could improve people's lives. Bart was a lot more focused in getting the title of doctor and the money that would come with it. With one person ready for marriage and the other one not, they split up again. And then shortly after this breakup, weird things started happening. On November 14th, 1989, Dolly and her roommate Angela came home and saw that the sliding glass door to their apartment was open. Dolly's cat Tabitha was missing, and they worried that someone had come into the apartment. They contacted the police, who said it looked like someone had actually lifted the sliding glass door off the tracks to open it. And so they showed the women how you can put a dowel in the way so that they can't force that door open. Nothing in the apartment appeared to be stolen, and it was assumed that Dolly's cat Tabitha had just slipped out the open door. Dolly was devastated, and she spent a lot of time looking for Tabitha. Then, on November 21st, a maintenance man at the college found some of Dolly's patient charts in a garbage can. Dolly realized that they had been taken from the lab along with casts of a patient's mouth that she was using to make dentures. That set of dentures was pretty much the entire grade for that class, so this was a very big deal. On November 27th, Dolly showed up to school with bloodshot eyes. Someone had replaced her contact lens solution with hairspray. And the same thing had happened to Dolly's roommate, meaning someone definitely went into their apartment. They then had the landlord change their locks. This was the point where Dolly realized she was being targeted, so she went to the campus police on November 29th to file a report. She suspected that Bart had made a copy of her keys, and he was the one behind this. Others in their social circle also suspected Bart, and they prodded him into at least admitting that he had stolen Tabitha. He ended up showing Dolly where he let her out, which was miles away on the edge of town. Tabitha had been gone for 2 weeks at that point, and she had always been an indoor cat, so Dolly was worried she wouldn't be alive, but she looked for her anyway. She walked around the area, she went door to door, asking if anyone had seen the cat, and miraculously, she found her. Bart seemed about as apologetic as a person could be, but Dolly wasn't anywhere near trying to smooth things over with him. She was understandably very angry at him. And when Dolly didn't forgive him, the harassment continued. On December 10th, Dolly went out to her car to drive to class, only to find that 2 of her lights were broken out, someone had let the air out of one of her tires, and there were scratches along both sides. The next day, her mailbox was broken into and a package was stolen. Dolly kept reporting these incidents to the campus police, and Bart began telling their friends that Dolly was acting weird and paranoid. She would flirt with him and lead him on, and then accuse him of doing these awful things that he definitely didn't do. Dolly was, if you listen to Bart, the entire problem. But it's clear someone was doing these things because they were documented. And they didn't even stop for a Christmas break. While Dolly was at her parents' house, someone dumped paint into her gas tank. And then, back at school the next semester, in January and February of 1990, the harassment continued. $1,500 in dental tools were stolen from Dolly's work area, and the dentures she had been working on were gone. Starting those over at that point would mean being so far behind she might not be done in time for her grade, and she'd fail the class. If she failed the class, there was no way she'd get the internship she wanted, and she might not even graduate on time. Desperate to find out what was going on, Dolly met with Bart with a tape recorder in her pocket. She recorded herself asking him if he could at least give her the dentures back. He told her that she would never find them. She asked him if he was sure and if there was just any way he could give them back to her. And he said something like, "What do you want me to say? How do I know you don't have a recorder on you?" Dolly went ahead and took Bart to the student honor board over this, but they dropped her complaint due to lack of evidence. And Bart just kept telling people he wasn't doing anything and Dolly was paranoid. And it seemed the campus police were wondering about her too, because there was talk about having her take a polygraph at the police station. Then on February 23rd, Bart showed up, banging on her door while she was watching a movie with a boyfriend. And so she called 911, but Bart was gone by the time they got there. He came back at 4 a.m. and started banging on the door again. So she called 911 again, and the officers made it out there while Bart was still there, and they told him to leave or get arrested, and he decided to leave. Finally, this was some proof that Bart was harassing her. And then it all stopped. No more vandalism to her car. No more things missing from the lab. No more break-in attempts at Dolly's apartment. And when she would see Bart out and about on campus or at a party, he would be downright pleasant to her. And Dolly was desperate to keep it that way. During those months of being stalked, she could hardly focus on anything and her grades were slipping. And when it stopped, she was able to bring her marks back up. To Dolly, it looked like Bart had finally gotten over her and their relationship to the point that things were smoothed over. But it was a cautious piece. Dolly did not want to trigger Bart into starting up again, and she only had a few months left to go. Bart was graduating and he would start working elsewhere, and she could finally move on in school without him around. So she acted friendly towards him so long as it looked like things were peaceful. Today's podcast is brought to you by newspapers.com, the ultimate destination for exploring the mysteries of the past. As I've said before, newspapers.com supports every Crimelines episode because if you check out my sources, you'll see that I use their newspaper archives to explore all of these true crime cases. And if you're fascinated by true crime, get ready to dive into the stories that made headlines. Newspapers.com offers nearly 1 billion pages of historical newspapers from the U.S. and beyond, and you can search the entire collection in seconds. Their vast newspaper collection is a goldmine for eyewitness accounts, crime scene photos, news reports, all those little details we like, and more. Whether you're interested in famous crimes or long-forgotten cases, newspapers.com gives you a front row seat to more than 300 years of history. For my listeners, newspapers.com has a special offer. Use the code CRIMELINES for an exclusive 20% discount on your subscription. That's promo code CRIMELINES at newspapers.com. Sign up today and start unraveling the true crime mysteries that keep you up at night. In May of 1990, Dolly went back home to visit with her family and to go to her little brother's graduation. But in early June, she went back out to Augusta for a job. Her landlord needed some help getting the financial books in order and was paying Dolly to handle it. On June 6th, 1990, Dolly planned to work on the accounting stuff at her apartment while she watched some TV in the background. At around 5:30 p.m., her roommate Angela got home and heard that the TV in the living room was on. She saw Dolly sitting up on the couch, but she was leaning back in an odd way. Then Angela noticed that there was blood all around her, and she ran out of the apartment. She went to a neighbor's house and asked them to call 911 because her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't make the phone call. Then Angela ran to another neighbor who was an emergency room resident to see if he could help. He was home and he went over to check on Dolly, but realized that she was beyond saving. At the age of 27, Dolly Hearn was dead from a single gunshot wound to her head. When the police arrived at the scene, the first thing that was done was to secure the gun that was on Dolly's lap. The gun, which did belong to Dolly, was one that she had gotten for protection during the stalking. To the investigators, this looked like a possible suicide. They processed the scene and didn't see anything that pointed them away from that assumption. But when Dolly's family was told about her violent death, they told the police to look at Bart Corbin. Bart was interviewed by the police at least twice, and the first time he talked to them, he said he hadn't seen Dolly in a couple of days. He had stopped by to check on her since she wasn't feeling well, and they talked for 20 or 30 minutes before he left. As far as where he was on the 6th, the day Dolly died, Bart said he was at school until noon practicing for his boards. Then he ran an errand and grabbed lunch, being back to the school within about 45 minutes. He stayed until 2 and then went home again, where he took a shower and made a few phone calls. One of the calls Bart made was to Dolly, but he said she didn't answer. He left a message saying that he couldn't go to a party that they had both been planning on attending. Bart said after that he went to a scheduled haircut at 3:15 and then he walked to campus around 4. He then met a friend at the gym at 5 and was there until about 5:45 when he went home. After making this statement, Bart was allowed to leave. His alibi accounted for most of his day with a few gaps in there when he was alone. Anne Rule noted in her book that his alibi was incredibly detailed. Like, the average person wouldn't really remember quite so many tiny details and points of time in their day. But this wasn't a red flag for investigators. What was a red flag was that they soon found out that Bart lied to them. Based on 2 witnesses, Bart was at Dolly's place on the day of her death. One person saw him knocking, and the other person said they saw him standing in her bathroom. So the next day, the investigators talked to Bart again, and they confronted him about these eyewitnesses. Bart then admitted that he hadn't told the truth, and he said it was because he was afraid of Dolly's father. When he thought Bart was behind the stalking and harassment, Dolly's father did talk to him. According to Bart, he threatened him. Bart was worried that if he said he was there that day, Dolly's father would assume he had something to do with it and come after him. Basically, the conversation Bart said happened a day or 2 before Dolly's death actually happened the day of the murder. He was there for 20 to 30 minutes while Dolly was watching soap operas and working. To him, she seemed normal, though she complained a little about needing more work hours because she needed the money. When he left, Dolly was alive and well. The investigation continued, but they kept coming up against the same roadblock. they could not exclude suicide as a possibility in Dolly's death. So the family hired an independent forensic pathologist, and he came to the same conclusion. There was nothing to say that this was homicide. So the case went cold, and Bart moved on with his life. Jen and her family had never heard the name Dolly Hearn before, so the investigators on Jen's case called the Augusta police. And with Bart now having a second person in his life dead in what looked like a staged suicide, they decided to take another look at Dolly's case. When Jen's funeral was held on December 10th, Bart attended with his family, but also in attendance were members of Dolly Hearn's family, who wanted to reach out to Jen's family and support them through this grief that they knew all too well. I want to point out a weird coincidence here that may or may not have been relevant. Remember Jen Corbin's online friend, Chris, who was really Anita? Well, Anita's last name was Hearn. She was no relation to Dolly, but was it possible that Bart saw that when he saw the emails in Jen's purse or when he started looking into things? Did he think that this may be someone from Dolly's family reaching out to Jen? Because that would have only contributed to his rage against her. Now, we don't know if Bart ever saw the last name, and it really is just a coincidence, but I can see it as even more reason Bart wouldn't want to simply divorce Jen because his connection to Dolly Hearn might enter his current life. But that's just speculation. Let's get back to the facts. We know in Dolly's case, the investigators built out a timeline of his movements based on his own self-reporting. And the new investigators certainly didn't miss the fact that Bart initially lied about where he was, and then he admitted he was at the scene. The investigators in Gwinnett County also wanted to build out a timeline for the night of Jen's murder, but Bart wasn't talking. They only got his alibi by subpoenaing the people he was with to testify in front of a grand jury in mid-December. To their credit, they all told the truth to the best of their recollection, though they did believe in Bart's innocence. On the Friday night before Jen's body was found, Bart was supposed to have dinner with his friends earlier in the evening, but they ended up not going out until around 10. They went to a sports bar and left around 1:10 in the morning based on the credit card receipts. The designated driver of the three men drove them home, and Bart was going to sleep at his friend Kevin's house where he had parked his truck. Bart had about 6 beers over the course of the night, so while he wasn't falling down drunk, he also shouldn't be driving. On the way to Kevin's house, they stopped at Walmart to buy coffee for the morning, and that means they would have gotten to Kevin's house around 1:35. Bart then changed his mind about spending the night and said he needed to go. Kevin said no and took his keys. Bart could just crash on the couch and leave in the morning. Kevin then went into the bathroom to get ready for bed, and Bart just kept saying he needed to leave. But Kevin had stashed the keys in a drawer so that Bart couldn't just grab them and go. As Kevin came out of the bathroom, though, he heard Bart say something about having his own set of keys. Apparently, Bart had the spare on him, so he was able to get into his truck and drive off. It was around 1:45 that Bart was on the road. The timeline then picks up with Bart's brother Bobby. According to him and phone records, Bart called him at 3:23 a.m. He said he was downstairs and he needed to come inside. Bart said he used the garage code to try to get in himself, but the door between the garage and the house was locked. He didn't want to call and wake Bobby up, so he first tried to just sleep in Bobby's vehicle that was in the garage, but it ended up just getting too cold overnight and he wanted to come inside. So how long was Bart in the garage? No one knows. Bobby's dog was barking around 2:30 in the morning, so it could have been then, but really the dog could have been set off by pretty much anything. It was a 12-minute drive from Kevin's house to get to Bobby's. So if Bart did get there at 2:30, prompting the dog to start barking, he had at least 30 minutes unaccounted for. But if he made up that story about climbing into Bobby's vehicle to go to sleep and he didn't really get there until he called at 3:23, he had nearly an hour and 45 minutes unaccounted for. And regardless of the length of time, this gap in his alibi was during the exact period of time that the ME said Jen was killed, and the time the neighbor heard Bart's truck at the house. This was a huge gap in the alibi, enough to say that this really isn't much of an alibi at all. The investigation into Jen's murder and the investigation into Dolly's death were running parallel, and it stopped being a question of if Bart would be arrested, but more which county would make their case first. Dolly's case had a huge hurdle that Jen's did not. They already proved Jen did not take her own life. But they had two experts from 1990 who said Dolly's case could have been suicide. They needed evidence to the contrary, and all they really had to do that with were the crime scene photos. The gun had been secured prior to being photographed, so unlike in Jen's case, they couldn't confirm the scene was staged based on where the gun landed. But what no one had done back in 1990 was a close examination of the blood spatter. This time, a forensic expert looked at the photos of Dolly's body, focusing on the blood evidence, and found 3 areas that indicated her body had been rearranged after death. And this included a smear of blood on her thigh. It could only have been smudged if someone touched her, and the responding officer said that the only change to the scene made before the photos were taken was in securing the gun. So the DA took the evidence they had, which included Bart's lie about not being there that he then admitted to, and a grand jury indicted Dr. Bart Corbin for felony murder and malice murder for the death of Dolly Hearn. He was arrested on his 41st birthday, December 22, 2004, while cameras rolled. Dolly's brother Gil told NBC News that watching Bart Corbin arrested on TV was one of the best days since they lost Dolly. Meanwhile, the investigation into Jen's murder continued. They had a lot of circumstantial evidence, like the hole in his alibi right when Jen was killed, and they have the ear witness testimony of the neighbor. Bart also had weird behavior after Jen's death, like waiting a couple of days to even try to talk to his sons, and then refusing to give Jen's family access to their belongings, their clothing, and even the Christmas gifts that Jen had bought and wrapped for them. Jen's father actually ended up breaking into the house to get those things, and though Bart reported this as a burglary, the police opted not to press charges. The investigators also found a journal of Bart's that had what looked like faked entries in the days leading up to Jen's death. On December 1st, he wrote about a deep conversation he had with Jen and how he was able to comfort her. On the 2nd, he wrote with detail about a sexual encounter that couldn't have happened because she was at her sister's house when he said it happened. And then on December 3rd, he wrote about all this time he spent with his sons and his family, which was time he wasn't spending with them. So why put together these fake journal entries if he wasn't going to later try to use those to prove that things were okay between him and Jen? Like I said, this was a circumstantial case, even though those circumstances were pretty strong. And if the investigators had a wish list for what they wanted in this case, a confession would probably be number 1. But number 2 would be if they could trace the murder weapon to the killer. Since wish number 1 seemed highly unlikely, they worked on tracing the gun. And they found that the last place the gun had been sold was in Troy, Alabama in the 1950s. Or that's at least the last place the gun was documented as having been sold. It was possible it was passed down within the same family, it maybe had been given away, or just sold to someone else. Alabama is not a state that requires much documentation when it comes to guns changing hands. But Bart just so happened to have a good friend named Richard who did live in Troy, Alabama. And Jen had told a friend that she found a parking stub in Bart's shirt while she was doing laundry. It was from a library in Alabama from November 29th, a few days before the murder. It was a 7-hour round trip from their house in Beaufort to Troy, and Jen had no idea why he would have made that trip. These pieces were definitely pointing in Richard's direction, so the police decided to go talk to him. And Richard was hesitant to speak with the police. He didn't seem to want to get involved. They tried a few times to get him to open up, but when they started pushing, talking about things like obstruction of justice, Richard did not respond well. This was the wrong tactic to take with this guy, and he completely shut down. The investigators really did think Richard was the person who could link Bart to the gun, but they didn't have that. So they went ahead and filed charges anyway. Bart was still in custody in Dolly's case when he was arrested for Jen's murder. Jen's case was going to go to trial first, and in the media, the defense made it clear they were going to argue this was no murder at all. Jen was losing her marriage. She had her heart broken when she found out her online love affair was really a catfish. And all of it was going to be exposed through the divorce where Bart would fight for custody. She couldn't handle the stress and opted to take her own life. The state agreed with the defense on one point, that the online affair was one of the reasons Jen died, but not at her own hand. It was Bart's anger and jealousy and his reaction to being rejected that led to her murder. The trial started in September of 2006, and on the second day of jury selection, the prosecutor was passed a note. It said, "Come out of the courtroom now." When he got out in the hall, he was told that Richard, Bart's friend, decided to talk. He finally admitted that Bart had called him and was looking for a gun. He said it was because Jen was cheating on him and he was worried for his own safety. And because Richard owned multiple guns, he told Bart he could get something for him. Days before Jen's murder, Bart drove to Troy and Richard gave him an older gun he had recently acquired when he traded a used lawnmower for the gun. Good old American bartering. The gun he gave Bart was the one used to kill Jen. This was new evidence, so the state turned it over, probably a little gleefully, to the defense. And then they all sat down for a little talk. Bart's attorney, on hearing that they could link Bart to the murder weapon, went from wanting to defend his client at trial to wanting to spare Bart's life and keep him off death row. At the time this case was happening, Georgia was executing 3 or 4 inmates a year. On September 15th, 2006, Bart Corbin took a deal. He admitted that he killed both Dolly Hearn and Jennifer Corbin. He spared their families the pain of an uncertain trial, but what he didn't spare, and something that I keep thinking about as I have been researching this case, he didn't spare his children. And I'm not talking just about the pain they suffered losing their mother. When Bart shot his wife and left the house in the overnight hours, he knew it was only going to end one way, with his 7-year-old and his 5-year-old finding her body. There was no alternative scenario, but his anger was so much more important to him than his own children that he did it anyway. Bart was given a sentence of life with parole eligibility. Jen Corbin's children were then adopted by her sister. Bart's brother Bobby spoke with CBS News and said that the family truly did believe Bart was innocent, but it turned out they had backed the liar. Months after Bart's guilty plea in April of 2007, the Medical College of Georgia awarded Dolly a posthumous Doctor of Dental Medicine degree so that she will forever be remembered as Dr. Dorothy Hearn. As part of the guilty plea, Bart had given up his right for a direct appeal, but he did file a handwritten petition for habeas corpus. He claimed he had ineffective assistance of counsel in making his guilty plea, and he didn't have it fully explained to him. I will get the full document up on my website, Basement Fort Productions. You can either go to the website and hit timelines and find the case, or there's always a link to each case's timeline in the show notes, and you can just click that. I mean, I paid for the document, so we might as well get our money's worth out of it. His petition was dismissed because he filed outside of the deadline, and I'm usually against barring appeals for procedural issues like this because they're so often not the inmate's fault, but rather their attorney. But it's really hard for me to muster the energy to care about fairness when it comes to Bart Corbin. But there is a reason I do care about this case on the whole and why I wanted to bring it up again, and that's because of Bart's sentence. He has parole eligibility. As of right now, he could apply for parole. Now, we have to ask ourselves when we're looking at criminal justice issues and even criminal justice reform and sentencing reform, what type of people deserve another chance in society? This is a man who has killed 2 women who rejected him, and he already had a second chance when he got away with killing Dolly Hearn back in June of 1990. And with that second chance, he abused and killed Jennifer Corbin 14 years later. So what we're really asking with Bart Corbin is, does he deserve a third chance? And that's something the Georgia Parole Board will have to decide, but I think we need to decide where our line is. I usually like to leave people to think about these things without inserting too much of my own opinion, but I have to say that I see compassionate release as he ages a possibility. However, until then, I think Bart Corbin is just too dangerous to let out. He has already killed twice, and he showed so little care that he left his young children to find their mother's body. I don't even know how you go about rehabilitating someone like that. Now, in the book, Too Late to Say Goodbye, Anne Rule brings up 2 other cases with some connection to Bart Corbin, well, kind of asking the question, were Dolly Hearn and Jennifer Corbin his only victims? Now, in my opinion, the connection in both of these other cases is very thin, and I wouldn't even include them in this episode under the title of Bart Corbin, except that they're both unsolved. So consider the rest of this episode in addendum in order to signal boost unsolved cases. Now, the first one is that of Harriet Gray. Harriet had moved from Tuscaloosa, Alabama to Tucker, Georgia, outside of Atlanta, so that she could be closer to her adult children and her young grandchildren. She was renting a room from an elderly woman while she waited for her condo back in Tuscaloosa to sell so that she could buy something new. Harriet was a dental hygienist, and she worked in the same dental practice that Bart Corbin was working at the time, and the 2 did know each other from work. On Sunday, September 8th, 1996, Harriet had plans to go out on a date, but told a friend that she might cancel and just go grocery shopping instead. The next day, she was supposed to start a new job that she was looking forward to, so an early night wouldn't be the worst idea. The next morning, the owner of the house that Harriet was living in came home and saw a bag of groceries sitting there in the entryway, and another bag had been dumped with a jar of pasta sauce just smashed. Harriet and her car were gone, and this scene was alarming enough that she called the police. The investigators were able to determine that Harriet had gone to the local Publix that evening and was last seen at 9:30 checking out with the same groceries found dropped at the house. An early theory in the case was that Harriet was at the front door bringing in the groceries when she was forced from the house into her car and abducted. But they had very few leads. Harriet and her car had seemingly vanished. 15 months later, fire department divers in Tuscaloosa were doing a training dive when they saw a submerged vehicle near the main boat dock. Due to algae growth on the windows, they could not see in, but they did alert the police to the car. The car was then pulled from the water, and it was Harriet's. Her body was in the driver's seat, and her hands were taped to the steering wheel. The police considered the possibility that Harriet's death was a suicide, which I think is unlikely given the totality of the circumstances. But they told Harriet's daughter that they found a journal that may have been Harriet's, and the last entry was from 6 months after she disappeared. This would mean that she went grocery shopping, dumped her groceries at the front door, and then went to start life over elsewhere with nothing but her car and the clothes on her back. No money, no use of a credit card, no job that required her social security number, nothing for at least 6 months. The police, as far as I can tell, have not given an indication of what Harriet may have been doing for those 6 months, or if they can actually confirm it really was her journal and that she was alive during that time. Harriet's daughter, who spoke with the media, seemed to lean towards Harriet not having been alive for 6 months after she disappeared, and she noted that Harriet's body was found dressed for a date. Striped blouse, skirt, and high heels, not something she would generally wear to go grocery shopping. So maybe Harriet did go on a date the night she disappeared, then went to the store, and then something happened. Being that Harriet was found in Tuscaloosa, which is 3 hours from Tucker, but it is where she previously lived, I think I would, if I were investigating this, look closer at people she knew from there and less at people like Bart Corbin. While the two did know each other, there was no evidence they ever spoke, more than just in passing, and given that Harriet was 20 years older than Bart, it just seemed unlikely he would have been the person she had a date with that day. I cannot tell at this point who is investigating Harriet's death. I mean, I guess no one is actually investigating it, but I'm not sure who stores the file. So if you do know anything, I'll leave the phone numbers for the Tuscaloosa police and the Tucker police in the show notes. So the second case that gets linked to Bart Corbin is the disappearance of Mary Lands. Though I can't find any podcasts that cover Harriet Gray's case, there are a few episodes out there on Mary's case if you do want more details. Just search for Mary Lands in your podcast app and they'll pop right up. The connection to Bart Corbin is that Mary and her husband were actually good friends of the Corbins. When Bart and Jen had gone on that trip to Italy shortly before they got married, the Lands went with them. After Mary divorced that husband, she moved from Georgia to Michigan, and she met another man named Christopher Pratt. In 2004, they were engaged and living together. On March 12, 2004, Mary and Chris got into an argument, and according to Chris, Mary left between 10 and 10:30 that night to go out on foot, maybe take a walk to cool off. All of her belongings, except for a white purse, were left behind, so she didn't bring her keys to her new vehicle with her or her cell phone. Scent dogs were used in the search for Mary, and they led to a nearby motel, but there was no other indication she had gone there. Bart Corbin is obviously not a suspect in that case. It happened in Michigan at a time when he was in Georgia. Other than Jen being very upset learning that her friend was missing, there really is no connection between the cases. I'm sure it's obvious that Mary's fiancé is a person of interest in the case, and he has a record for intimate partner violence from before he met Mary and even after her disappearance. He spent 6 years in prison for what he did to one girlfriend, and he was paroled in 2013 before being arrested in 2019 for a sexual assault that he was then later acquitted of. Just like with Harriet's case, if you have any information, I will leave the phone number to the Marshall Police Department in the show notes, and all tips can go to them. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basementfourproductions.com/support.